From the News Channel 5 Network, this is MorningLine with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. Nick Barris here with you on a Tuesday. A good show on tap for you. We're going to talk legal issues specifically this morning. A lot of things that we can talk about. We'll probably start at the top, with the harsher penalties now in place here in the state of Tennessee when it comes to protests, with an attorney who actually is in a position to know a bit about this, having looked at some of these cases that have come up with folks being arrested during the protests around the Capitol and the like. But beyond that, we're also going to talk about some high-profile cases that were scheduled to go to trial that haven't come up yet, and how things are shaping up with the pandemic as the courts begin to reopen. And let's face it, they have been open to a degree all along, but in terms of jury selection and criminal trials and how all that works out, where do we stand on all of that? We'll get into that and more. And who better to talk about this than News Channel 5 legal analyst, my namesake, Nick Leonardo. Good morning, Nick. How are you?
Doing well. Good morning to you, Nick. It's a bit different doing MorningLine like this, but the things have changed, have they not?
Oh, it has. It has. We social separate and the like. And so anyway, this is good. Today, we've been meaning to do another legal show with you, and we'll open up the phone lines if folks have questions as we go along. But first, Nick, tell us a little bit about, your connection and what you've been observing, with regard to the protesters and some of how you've been involved there. And then we can get into this legislation that the governor just signed that I know you have some thoughts on. So give us a little background on where you've been with regard to some of this going on.
Well, I guess, like most of the rest of Nashville, I've been keeping an eye on what's been going on down there. And some days, just the visual images kind of harken back to a time before I was born. I don't think Nashville is a whole lot different than a lot of cities. And there's really a wave happening in America, and people are wanting to see change. And states are handling this very differently. And in this particular case, these young people who wanted to be a part of the process were camping out almost 70 days outside the Capitol, and they wanted to meet with Governor Lee. And obviously, there were a few hundred arrests for various things that happened. And then there was a special session that appeared that it was only for two purposes. One of them would have been to come up with the Coronavirus Immunity from Liability Act and who's immune and when they're immune. And the other one was more or less directed at these quote unquote protesters, whatever that necessarily means. And so they have really stiffened and harshened the penalties for folks who are camping at the state capitol, or what they perceive to be camping. And that has always been kind of a vague statute, but as a result of the special session, they have actually spelled out exactly what that means to constitute an offense. Now there's mandatory, it's now a felony. There's mandatory jail time if there is a conviction. And there's a mandatory 12-hour hold, which is something that we don't see other than in domestic violence cases. So now we do have mandatory jail time on some misdemeanor offenses associated with this, as well as felonies. And the only other misdemeanor offenses that carry mandatory jail time that I can think of in the state of Tennessee at this time would be DUIs. So this is sweeping legislation in an effort to try to get these young people off of state property there by the Capitol.
Hey, let me ask you what you perceive the definition of illegal camping to be. What level does that have to be? I mean, if you and I were just to walk past the Capitol after hours, I mean, that's not camping. If we stood there for a while, what do you understand it to be as illegal camping?
Well, I think that the legislature had to address this because I believe the statute was previously very nebulous as to what constituted, quote unquote, camping. But now they were more than specific. And for example, if you are there after the hours of 10 p.m., and then if you're there before the hours of 7 a.m., if you and I set up a couple of lounge chairs out there one evening and just were enjoying the evening, if we got there early at 5:30 and set up a couple of lounge chairs, that could constitute camping. And if a trooper or Capitol Police in their discretion decided to arrest you, then they could do that. So I'm not so sure that this is a constitutional piece of legislation. I mean, you have a fundamental right to assemble on state property. You have a fundamental right to make your desires and thoughts known and to assemble. And so to impede this fundamental right, they have to have a compelling governmental interest, and they have to show that this is the least restrictive way in which they can further that interest. And it seems a bit draconian and more of a knee-jerk reaction to something that certain members of the General Assembly did not like occurring outside of the building.
You know, it's interesting. I saw some stories, and I think our I-team even looked at that. Can you give me some examples of criminal offenses that don't rise to the level of Class E felony right now by comparison to camping?
So you could have half ounce of marijuana. You could have a first, second, third offense DUI. You could commit an offense of domestic violence. You could steal something in a misdemeanor amount. You could commit some sort of misdemeanor vandalism. I mean, you could go and key a brand new car on a car lot, and if it was under $1,000, you know, that could be a misdemeanor as well. So there's a whole host of things that are misdemeanors. And right now, most of these young people have been arrested for what amounts to a series of different sorts of misdemeanors, like trespassing and exits and entrances, public egress, to disorderly conduct. And I've always thought it was kind of odd that you can be charged by the state of Tennessee for trespassing on Tennessee property, because I've always said that's kind of akin to robbing or mugging yourself. It's almost impossible to do. But again, our General Assembly has definitely spoken. Now, there are some other things in the legislation, when it comes to protecting our first responders. And I do think that those provisions were probably constitutional to beef up, if they're trying to arrest you and they get hurt, some serious bodily injury as a result of that, then it could be, an aggravated assault. So some of those things I do think would be constitutional, but the stuff about the camping, I think it's just a knee-jerk reaction because they did not want these kids out here. And I think it's important to note that in legislative politics, unlike maybe when you run for judge, when you're elected, whether it be the president or whether it be, a senator or whether it be the governor or state representative, you're the representative for all the people, whether they voted for you or not, whether they're in your party or not, you become their elected representative. And as such, I think it's incumbent upon all of those people that hold those offices to bear that in mind. It doesn't necessarily mean that someone supported you, that they're entitled to your time. You become the governor or the president or the senator for everybody in that jurisdiction.
Let's take a phone call for you real quick, Nick. We've got Joe, and we want to get him going before we take our first break. See if you could, let me know if you can't hear him, but here's Joe on the phone. Joe, what's your question or comment? Good morning, Joe. Are you there, Joe? Usually Joe's. Yeah, go ahead. What's your question or comment, buddy?
I just wonder, of all these campers and protesters.
Okay, go ahead, Joe. What?
Okay.
Just talk on the phone, like you always do. Like you always do.
The protesters, I'm just wondering, where do they have the time? Do they have jobs, or what do they, have the time to go up there and pitch tents and sit around? I don't understand. Most people have a job to go to, or something to do, or to stay at home with the children, or...
Okay, Nick, maybe you can address some of the perception, people like Joe and others, and it almost seems like a separate issue to me, of course. Not that I really don't think that should be an issue. If someone wants to protest or go, they find time one way or the other. But I hear that time and again. It's kind of like, well, what are they doing down there every day protesting on all these days in a row? God, tell them to go get a job. I mean, you hear that. And I'm just wondering, I know some of the folks that have been involved down there. What would you say their response to that would be?
Well, it's good to hear from Joe. It's good to know that Joe's doing well, and he seems to always be a faithful caller to your MorningLine show, Nick. But in response to Joe's question, that's a fair question. And I would say to Joe that that's something that's came up in my mind, but it's important to remember that the majority of the people that were camping are there every day. A lot of them are students. A lot of them are in school. In schools virtual, some schools aren't in session, and it's been the summer. So I think, a large amount of those young people are in school. But when it comes to, when they have different gatherings in the evening, or they have different protests in the evening, then you do see people from all walks of life get involved or come down when something's scheduled. But I would say that a large majority of these young people are indeed students.
It's a good point. All right, and let's take another call. We've got one from Ann. Ann, good morning. Go ahead, Ann.
Good morning.
Hi.
I learned to protest by a group of ladies from Holy Name Church. They taught me to protest at the Capitol. They spent many a day protesting at the Capitol. I call them the gray-haired ladies. They, at the time in the 70s, were in their 50s and 60s, and many of them marched in Washington. At the time, I was young. I'm in my 60s now, and I've spent many a year teaching my children how to protest at the Capitol, and I taught them to do it well. The governor has done what he has done to get these young people from off the steps of the Capitol. Well, they deserve to be protesting. I thank Mr. Nick Leonardo for what he is doing for Justin and these other young people. They are doing what they have earned the right to do. What has happened as far as the felony convictions is a joke. I have many people in my family that should be serving time for DUIs that are not doing it. And to have a felony conviction on your record for protesting on the Capitol steps is a disservice to anyone protesting their rights for any reason.
As long as it remains peaceful, and I hear where she's going. If you agree with her, and I think you do, Nick, I mean, how long before someone is arrested on a felony charge for this camping that we see a legal challenge to a higher court that it's unconstitutional?
Well, so someone's going to have to be prosecuted under this, and I think it takes effect in October. So when someone is prosecuted and charged or convicted of a felony, then they would have standing to bring a civil rights lawsuit in court. And I just don't know that this was well thought through. But to Ann's point, what if John Lewis, C.T. Vivian, and Diane Nash had just taken everyone's word for, lunch counters and separate is equal and poll taxes and all these other things? I mean, if it wasn't for, this is what makes America truly one of the best countries in the world, is the fact that people have this right to protest. And, the greater the protests get, change comes about. It took Bloody Sunday and the Edmund Pettus Bridge to begin to bring about the change that we needed in America, that it's still ongoing. And that's what this is exactly a reflection of. But I think the legislature, if they wanted to ensure that these protesters were going to continue to be on the state capitol property, then this is one way to do it, because I don't think that our district attorney, I can't speak for him, but I don't think he's going to turn around and make these young people felons because they were out there at 5:30 a.m. Protesting. But we'll see how this plays out.
All right. That's an excellent point. We'll take a break, Nick. When we come back, we've got more phone calls for you and much more to talk about with legal analyst here at News Channel 5, Nick Leonardo. Stick with us. Back with more right after this.